This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast dealing with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breege Burke. Today we are going to look at another hag figure from English folklore. This one, rather than being a water spirit, is one that lives in a cave, and her name is Black Anise. I recall hearing about Black Anise when I was young. There was a series of books that had come out must have been the 1980s, maybe even they came out in the 70s, but I had certainly purchased them in the 80s. Those were the days when you subscribed and got your book a month thing from Time Life. And they had a series on ghosts, night terrors, gods and goddesses, all of this kind of folklore. And Black Anise was certainly, was mentioned there. And she's also mentioned in Froude's book on fairies. Now, Black Anise is, trying to research her background is a little strange because, like a lot of these figures, there's some gray area between what she's supposed to be. First of all, what is she? What is she supposed to be? And we have some specifics about what she's actually supposed to do. But what's not clear is whether or not Black Anise is a witch, whether she's a hag, whether she's a fairy, or whether she's a ghost or some combination of the above. Because she has attributes that suggest that she is some kind of undead creature, or a ghost in some accounts, which suggests that she's a living person that has come back in this form. But everything else about her attributes suggests that she is definitely has a fairy kind of a nature or a supernatural kind of nature. Okay, so how is she described? She is described as they refer to her as a bogeyman. She's also known as Black Agnes or Black Anna, and imagined as a blue-faced hag with iron claws and a taste for human flesh, particularly children. She haunts the countryside in Leicestershire, living in a cave in the Dane Hills with a great oak tree at the entrance. And this cave of hers in the Dane Hills is supposed to have a tunnel that runs to Leicester Castle and also to the Church of St. Mary de Castro. So she has this sort of underground network. So there's definitely an underground feel to her. When you talk about caves, you talk about tunnels. You have this is very much in line with the idea of of an underworld spirit, or of somebody, either a fairy spirit or an underworld spirit. As a lot of times the she, even in spite of the fact that the name means hill, generally they were living underneath the earth. So there is a sense of this. Now, like Peg Powler and Jenny Greenteeth, Black Anise is considered to be, a lot of people consider her tale to be a cautionary tale. Because what she is said to do, and I'm going to read this from the Wikipedia entry, she's said to venture out at night looking for unsuspecting children and lambs to eat. Now, of course, the fact that it's lambs and small children particularly, again, you have this idea of somebody who devours the young and innocent, okay? Because as we know, lamb becomes a metaphor for, the Lamb of God, the sacrifice of God, becomes like a Jesus image. So it's this idea of the devouring of that. This old haggish woman with blue skin, which we'll talk about, has this devouring aspect to her. Okay, so after she finds them, she eats them, then tans their skins, hanging them on a tree before wearing them around her waist. Sounds very, Ed Gein. sounds pretty creepy. But they said she would reach inside houses to snatch people. Legend has it if she used her iron claws to dig her cave out of the side of a sandstone cliff, making herself a home which is known as Black Anise's Bower Close. The legend led to parents warning their children that Black Anise would get them if they did not behave. Okay, hence we see the moralistic side of it. She was also known to hide in the branches of her oak tree, waiting to leap upon unsuspecting prey. Other traditions stated that when she ground her teeth, people could hear her, giving them time to bolt their doors and keep away from the window. It is said that cottages in Leicestershire were purposely built with small windows so Black Anise could only get a single arm inside. When she howled, she could be heard 5 miles away. Then the cottagers would fasten skins across the window and place protective herbs about it to keep themselves safe. Okay. So this sounds like a very traditional kind of fairy story that we see in England. There seems to be partially an element of somebody, a fearful natural force, this devouring feminine force that comes from under the earth. There's definitely, we see more clearly now, not only in myth but in folklore, the way that this takes shape and the way that this ends up being used in the culture. Now, by the way, that's not the only description I've seen of her. I have a few other ones. There's a few other descriptions of her from there's a couple BBC sites where they refer to Black Anise as having broken teeth, a hideous face, broken teeth, pointy nails, and an unearthly scream. In another version of her, she has let's see. She is a old blue-faced woman with one eye. Okay, that's another description of her, which reminds me of the gray eye in ancient Greece. If you ever saw the movie Clash of the Titans, the 3 blind old women who shared one eye between them, the gray eye were actually representatives of old age. They were wise, and because they were blind, obviously they could see everything. They had all kinds of intimate knowledge of prophecy and the underworld and all of that. But they had one eye between them, and they also were cannibalistic, by the way. So this idea of old age as being cannibalistic in some fashion, we can connect that to some other ideas that we have about cannibalism as it appears in myth and folklore. Okay. Now, according to this BBC article, it says that her gruesome actions after she ate children, once the skins were dry, she would sew them together and make them into clothes for herself. Furthermore, she used the remains of the children to decorate the interior of her cave. And it's also understood that Black Anise used her cave to hide from the sun, which was believed could turn her to stone. Okay, and that makes her very similar to other trolls and other figures which could turn into stones. In fact, certainly not all standing stone legends, but there are many that make reference to the idea that these were fairy creatures that stayed out past the cockcrow and were turned into stone. Sometimes they're turned into dust, sometimes they're turned into stone. Because they're creatures of darkness and can't bear the light, like vampires and such. But she used her cave to hide from the sun, and then she used the cover of darkness to perform her slaughters. So, okay. There's actually a really good article written by Kate Westwood that was published around Samhain 1998, and it's on a site called White Dragon. It's whitedragon.org/UK. And she has a really good article where she's actually did a fair amount of research on Black Anise. I found it very difficult. I went through scholarly articles, I went through other things, and I'm finding that getting specific information on these particular figures is very, very difficult. And as I had said in the last episode, I'm also very curious about people who claim to have personal encounters with such a creature. I mean, yes, we talk about them as, oh yes, there's this idea of this fantastic hag figure that eats children, and it's like, ooh, you better not be out late at night and go over in this area, way of parents scaring their children into behaving. But on the other hand, there's people who have claimed, you do hear from time to time people who have claimed to have seen things. So I'm always curious to know if there are people who say, I'm not implying the reality or the, any kind of, I'm not necessarily saying by asking that question, that these are real figures that, that really exist, in some kind of material or real way. But on the other hand, I don't know that. I don't know if there is some kind of, basis in fact or experience of these legends. So I'm always curious about that. And this is probably the only place that I have seen stories. But although additionally, apparently if you take the Leicester ghost tour, which I was in Leicester in 2018, I wish I'd known about this. I would have gone down into town and taken this tour. Totally. I'd been up at the university at a conference, and I would have loved to have gone. This would have been just right up my alley, but I hadn't heard about it until now. But next time I go to Leicester, you can be sure. What's interesting to me, though, is that there is a ghost tour that that Leicester has. That, because there's other associations of Leicester, for example, with Lady Jane Grey and Richard III, and there's other things that go on. Oh, and by the way, that's another possible origin of Black Anise, is that she is a witch who predicted the demise of Richard III. But what I find interesting is that I'm reading this article. It's a BBC article on Leicester. There's a Blue Badge tour guide, Colin Crosby, who has the ghost tour of Leicester, and it's and like I said, a lot of the English towns do have these. And he mentions, he says, one of the ports of call on the walk will be the Turret Gateway by Leicester Castle. Mr. Crosby says there have been sightings of a creature called Black Anise, a wizened crone said to eat children. And that's what he said. She's seen here with her hideous face, broken teeth, etc. And an unearthly scream. But supposedly, and that's why I begs the question, there's people who claim that they've actually seen this hag wandering the grounds of this church near Leicester Castle, but also by St. Mary de Castro church. Okay, so where does Black Anise come from? Well, this is where things get a little weird. So the first known reference to her, and I'm taking this from Wikipedia, was, they said, an 18th century title deed that referred to a parcel of land or a close known as Black Annie's Bower Close. The first volume of County Folklore, 1895, published by the Folklore Society, mentions two such title deeds dated May 13th and 14th, 1764. Okay. So, now, whether or not Black Anise existed before 1764, presumably, if there was this idea of a legend of a place like that. But then the question becomes, well, who is this Black Annie or Black Anise? And some possibilities, okay, now some people try to link her to Celtic mythology based on Danu or Anu, Anu and Anise. And Danu, of course, is what, a lot of rivers in Europe, like the Danube, and there's other, the Dane Hills actually may also be named for Danu. And they also indicate it may derive somewhere from Germanic mythology connected to Hel, whom we also did a podcast on. Some people think it goes back to the mother goddesses of ancient Europe, who he contends was thought of as a devourer of children. It's interesting. That's Donald Alexander Mackenzie's 1917 book, Myths of Crete and Pre-Hellenic Europe. So, and again, we'll look at those ancient comparisons as part of our narrative here. And he thinks Black Anise is similar to the Indic Kali, the Gaelic, I want to say it's Muirtach, but I could be saying that wrong. People have abused me for my Irish pronunciation, to which I say, get lost. I even hear Irish people that don't know how to pronounce Irish words, so, just, leave me alone on that one. And the Calich, I want to say it's the Calich Bear. I'm positive I'm saying that completely wrong, but, the Calich or Calich is considered to be the hag figure connected to winter, who, by the way, also has blue skin and red eyes, and she is associated with winter. In fact, she is the one who holds Breege captive until Breege actually escapes in the spring and marries the Angus, the Summer King. So it's, so again, the idea of the hag being associated with winter. So he mentions a few others. Now, they said the legend may derive from a memory of sacrifice to an ancient goddess. Maybe. Ronald Hutton talks about another version, and he's not the only one, in his book Triumph of the Moon, which is a pretty well-researched, one of the few well-researched works on modern pagan witchcraft. And he suggests that Black Anise was based on a real person named Agnes Scott. And I have seen this elsewhere, not just in Hutton's work. A late medieval anchoress. Now, an anchoress is a female renunciate who is not necessarily a nun or whatever, but they live in a very secluded, almost walled off from society. Julian of Norwich was an anchoress. But they basically have cut themselves off from the world. They live a life that they just live in their things. They pray all day, and they all they have is their meals, and they live an extremely simple life dedicated to prayer. So so Agnes Scott was either an anchoress or, by some accounts, a Dominican nun who cared for a local leper colony. Born in Little Antrim, lived a life of prayer in a cave in the Dane Hills, and was buried in the churchyard in Swithlin. Hutton suggests the memory of Scott was distorted into the image of Black Annis, either to frighten local children or due to the anti-anchorite sentiment that arose in the Protestant Reformation. Okay. And they felt that in the Victorian era that was when there was a confusion with the goddess Anu. And of course, Hutton mentions Black Annis because some people try to associate her with the Wiccan idea of the crone, which, again, there's a lot of people who are, I'm trying to make some of these connections, although I don't think I'm suggesting that they're all the same deity. Just that they have very curious similarities in the way that they represent the archetype of the dark feminine. Okay. Now he says that the connection between Black Annis and Agnes Scott was made previous to Hutton, including the gravesite and cave in the Leicester Chronicle from 1842. Many of the modern conceptions of Black Annis were popularized in a poem by John Hayrick. Okay, and I'll read that here because I've seen this poem in multiple places. "'Tis said the soul of a mortal man recoiled to view Black Annis's eye, so fierce and wild. Vast talons foul with human flesh there grew, in place of hands and features livid blue, glared in her visage, whilst her obscene waist warm skins of human victims close embraced. Not without terror they the cave survey, where hung the monstrous trophies of her sway. 'Tis said that in the rock large rooms were found, scooped with her claws beneath the flinty ground." Okay, and so that's a sort of poetical form of her attributes. And I should also mention here that there is a custom. She is associated with aniseed, or anise, which is the licoricey flavored herb that you find in like ouzo. And she's also associated with cats, and she's sometimes referred to as Cat Anna. And this custom, and I'm sorry, I don't like this custom because I am absolutely wild about cats. I fucking love cats. Okay, I just absolutely love them to death. So, they said if she was, so the dead cat would be dragged. There's a ritual. It was supposed to celebrate the end of winter. It was a mock hare hunt. Okay. And instead of a hare, they would soak a cat in aniseed, a dead cat, and drag it before the hounds in front of her bower to celebrate the end of winter. Okay. And it was, and they said, what was it? According to Catherine Briggs, who wrote Encyclopedia of Fairies, she says that, wait a minute, I'm just lost my place here. This drag hunt was held on Easter Monday, also known as Black Monday, and led from Anis's bower to the mayor of Leicester's house. The bait dragged was a dead cat drenched in aniseed. The custom died out at the end of 18th century. Well, thank God. But clearly, if this custom had been around at that time, then we know this is a legend that's been around since at least the 1700s. And probably more before that. And then they say here another tradition that Black Annis, in the form of Cat Anna, lived in the cellars beneath Leicester Castle, and that there was an underground passage extending from the cellars to the Dane Hills. And that's what I had mentioned about Leicester Castle being haunted by her, as well as the nearby church. Okay, so this is where she seems to come from. So I'm just looking to see. I have an entry from the British folklore, from English Heritage. I don't think much more is being said here than what I've already said. So in 1874, a contributor to Leicester Chronicle wrote, "Little children who went to run on the Dane Hills were assured that she, Black Anna, lay in wait there to snatch them away to her bower, and that many like themselves, having scratched to death with her claws, sucked their blood and hung up their skins to dry." Okay. So let's see. I'm just looking at the Oxford, the Dictionary of English Folklore. I don't think there's any, she was in the habit of crouching among the branches of an old pollard oak which grew in the cleft of the rock over her cave or bower, ever ready to spring like a wild beast on any stray, on any stray children passing below. The cave she was traditionally said to have dug out of the solid rock with her fingernails, which we had said. In the 1890s, working-class girls in Leicester still spoke of her, calling her Cat Anna, and said she lived in an underground tunnel. Okay. So, again, we have this same idea. Okay, so I think we've got the basic idea of who she is. So now let's look at some of the stories. I'm going to look at Kate Westwood's account right here. So I'm going to read some. I'm not going to read the whole thing, obviously. I don't feel that I should do that, but I want to read at least little pieces of this that I think will be informative. Okay, let's see. Okay, so they're talking about the cave in the Dane Hills, and she says, by the late 19th century, her cave was filling up with earth. A housing estate built just after the First World War now covers the area. A 19th century eyewitness said the cave was 4 to 5 feet wide and 7 to 8 feet long, having a ledge of rock for a seat running along each side. A tunnel was said to connect Black Anice's bower with Leicester Castle, and she had the free run of its length. An account of Anise was related by an evacuee to Ruth Tongue in 1941. 3 children were sent out by their wicked stepmother to collect firewood. As night descended, they feared to see Black Anise, who only came out after dark, for, it was said, daylight would turn her to stone. They heard a snuffling, and through a hole in their witchstone saw Black Anise. Unable to escape her whilst carrying the faggots, they dropped them and ran. Anise bloodied her legs on the bundles, and mumbling and cursing to herself, went to her bower to rub her legs with salve. Then she came back for the children and caught up with them at their cottage door. Their dad came out with an axe and hit Anise full in the face. She began to run for her cave, shouting, "Blood, blood," but just then the Christmas bells began to peal, and she fell down dead. Okay, well, interesting story. The evacuee claimed Anice's howling could be heard as far as 5 miles away, and when Anise ground her teeth, the sound was so loud all the people had time to lock and bar their doors. And also because people didn't have window glass in those days, witch herbs were tied above the apertures to stop Anise reaching inside with her long arms and grabbing their babies. This was why Leicester cottages have only one small window. Anise was said to be very tall with a blue face and long white teeth. Others said her teeth were yellow rather than white and that she had only one eye. All agreed that her face was hideous and blue. So she goes over the history, and yes, she's the one here who mentions that the association of her with the woman who foretold Richard III's death. It says, as he rode over Leicester's bow bridge on his way to the Battle of Bosworth, his spur foot struck a stone on the bridge. The wise woman told how on his return it would be his head that hit that stone. When Richard's corpse was brought back over Bow Bridge, his head indeed hit the same place. A tablet was put on the bridge, newly built last century, saying his head was dashed and broken as a wise woman forsooth or had foretold, who before Richard's going to battle, being asked of his success, and said that where his spur struck, his head would be broken. Okay. Now she mentions the hare hunt, and she said the hunt gave way to an annual event known as the Dane Hills Fair. And she also makes some connections in this article to the idea of it being the gateway to hell, spelled H-E-L, the Norse way, because she mentions something called the Humber or Holston Stone, not far from the village of Humberstone. Also called Hell or the Holy Stone, it's believed that fairies lived in it, for people heard their groaning. Folklore claims there was a nunnery on the spot, and from it to Leicester Abbey ran an underground tunnel. Well, not really. It's not Leicester Abbey, which is actually St. Mary of the Meadows, I believe. This is the other. I want to say Mary del Castro is Mary of the House, basically. So there might be a mix-up there. The tunnel and the groaning bear a resemblance to the Anise story, especially since suggested there was once a cave near the Hellstone, which she was also supposed to dwell. This was called the Hell Hole. Whether any credence can be attached to this is doubtful. For one thing, Humberston is on the other side of the city center to the Dane Hills, and there's never been any suggestion that Anise has spread beyond the Dane Hills. However, the name Hell may be from the same root word as holy, but could also be derived from the Norse goddess Hel. Okay. She mentions the icy coldness of Hell, which I think might have something to do with the blue skin, as I'm going to talk about. And they also they said there's a there's comparisons drawn to Hecate, Anubis, and things like that. Okay. And in addition, talking about other hags, we talked about the one in Ireland, but she mentions another one called Gentle Annie or Gentle Anise, which is a Scottish legend, whose name also may be derived from Anu. And it's likely because they said many Scottish myths share an origin with the Irish. She may have been a weather spirit watching over the gales on the Firth of Cromarty. As spasmodic squalls can blow up in moments, gentle Annie had a reputation for treachery. Presumably, she was called gentle in the fearsome, polite way that referred to elven folk as fair in terror of offending them, and as we refer to the Erinyes as the kindly ones, or the angry dead of Rome as the manes or kindly ones. So so again, there's this idea that the Scottish give a nicer name, but in this case, she's actually considered to be a kind of elemental force, which does fit in with the idea of, the forces of the terrifying forces of Earth that are destructive, as being connected with the feminine, because obviously, in at least in European culture and a lot of what we think of as Near Eastern and Western culture, the Earth has a feminine association. Okay. Actually, in some of their versions, they equate her with Brige to some degree. But there's not no whole lot here that I'm not sure that I entirely agree with that. But it's interesting. And then she mentions the wild hunt or just a baby eater. It says, as the Khalit represents winter, Anise's eating of children and animals takes an interesting turn. She could be the color of the herd, a sort of female version of the wild hunt, taking the weakest, meaning the naughtiest, the stupidest, whatever, so that the strongest will survive. Now, when you think about that, too, that may fit in a lot with Christmas legends that say, that the legends of Krampus, for example, and other similar figures. We see Frau Perkta and Grilla, these winter hags who devour. And if you think about it, the winter time would be a time for devouring meat. You don't have things that grow so much in the summer. That may be the time that you kill your animals and, have the meat for the winter or go hunting in the winter. So there may well be a connection between the need to devour flesh and the cold winter months. Now, she mentions it as a possible memory of a human sacrifice, or the reality, again, as we saw in some of these other myths, of the child mortality, for not all children reached adulthood. So the devouring of Anise would be another reason for such a disaster, just as Peg Pallet or Jenny Greenteeth might be the reason so many people drowned because they were dragged into the water. So to be dragged away by the devouring hag associated with the underworld brings us back to that idea of children dying before their time, which we initially discussed in the Aore podcast. Figures like the Lamia in particular sound a lot like Black Anise because they are also cannibalistic. And so it's not just a matter of the children die, it's a matter of they're devoured, they're eaten. And as I've mentioned, cannibalism in mythology tends to be, if you take the family unit as being central or being so very, very important, okay, and if you haven't heard the Aore podcast, I go into great detail there about this. But the family unit is very, very important. And so anything that threatens the family unit, infant death, okay, problems between fathers and sons, women who choose not to have babies in that particular case, fathers who lock up their daughters and, try to keep them virgins. You have all of these different things, and also incest. Incest is interesting because it almost imparts a magical quality to the person because they've crossed a particular boundary that they should not cross. Diane Purkis's book on fairies. I'm trying to remember the exact name of it, but it's she has a work on fairies. But I know she specifically talks about this aspect of incest, and so it's all of these things, as I've mentioned, are things that restrict the family or that restrict the growth or the continuation. If you go by the Abrahamic idea of, God says, be fruitful and multiply, this is something that certainly curtails that process. So you've got these, so you've got the idea of these baby eaters that, when you have the new life that's born, if we think about what the divine child represents, divine child in Jungian psychology is past, present, and future. It represents the innocence of our past, if we remember what it was like to be a child before we had all these responsibilities of adulthood. The child also represents which, by the way, may not have been as much of an association in those days when you were considered to be a grown-up pretty darn quickly. If you look at the way babies were portrayed, they looked like little old people. I mean, I don't think there was there was definitely the sense that babies were more vulnerable and needed to be protected, but there was not the kind of necessarily all the same level of sentimentality. It was kind of like as soon as a child could walk, it's like, right, okay, it's time to get outside and work the fields. You know, there wasn't this. I mean, I'm sure there was play in childhood, but you know, it all depended on your station in life, I think. Anyway, but the child as the past, the child as the present, which would represent a particular side, especially if we live a very, very serious life. Like Jung would say, well, the child might appear in the dreams of somebody who's like a very staid accountant whose whole life is just about going to work and going home. You know, they might dream of the child as a compensation because the child would represent that playful aspect to life. And of course, they represent the future because the child represents new beginnings and new possibility. So when you have something that is going to be devouring of this, then it's like, you know, it's the same thing as the hero myth. The child, the divine child there is always threatened by some force, by either, by either a father or uncle figure or some other kind of villainous figure who creates a crisis, or wants to see the child destroyed. In some cases, in Greek mythology, Hera fills that role. You know, she's looking to destroy the hero child. Even in the story of Jesus, King Herod is looking to destroy him, you know, so there's this idea of destruction, that which needs to be protected, and that, you know, and the way in which when you couldn't protect and you lost your child, you know, Black Anise came and you know, ate the child. Now she also mentions here, that like the wild hunt, but both all the hag types, and again, very, very typical of the dark feminine, they can be protectors or colors of the herd. So they could kill something off or kill someone off, or they could also be protective of them. And we also see this as an attribute of many ancient gods and goddesses, even ones that are not considered to be, chthonic. That don't belong to the underworld, or considered to be these scary forces. Artemis being a good example. She could kill children, and she was also a protectress in childbirth, probably an older role of hers that got rolled into her when she became a Greek Olympian and a virgin goddess. But, and speaking of, Kate Westwood also compares them to the Black Virgins. She said they supposedly granted eternal bliss to the dead babies. So the Black Madonnas and the Black Virgins. I had that conversation in another podcast with Ellen Jones. But they were here she's suggesting that Black Anise could be the quote unquote dark version of the Black Virgin. Like if the Black Virgin serves this benevolent function, that this would be a more malevolent one. And she says, perhaps the sucking of bodies dry and leaving them on oak is another view of the belief that the dark veiled side of the goddess takes the soul of the dead down through the world tree, usually a yew, into the world of the ancestors. It could also be a version of hanging on the world's tree in order to gain knowledge. And we know about sacrifice on the tree. And again, if you think about the sacrifice, if you think about Jesus as supposing to be the sacrificial lamb on the cross, which is another type of tree, and then about the fact that Black Anise also eats young lambs, okay, which goes back to what was Lynn Thurman's point in her talk at Magical Women's Conference, that there may be an initiatory quality to this. In the way that Babylon was, you know, she's drunk on the blood of the saints. You know, you're ground up in the process of becoming, you know, of moving on to this next stage, of dying to this other life to perhaps do something else. But there's this loss of innocence. You know, there's a beginning that's lost, and it is reminiscent almost of the idea of the flood. You know, the idea that something is here and created and is blooming, but there's something, you know, for some reason it's corrupted or something, so it has to be wiped out and you have to start again. Or even if it has quote unquote yielded fruit, you know. But here we're actually seeing this. So to me, I feel like this has more of a connection to figures like the Lamia or Marmo or Gello or some of those child stealers, because they represent a cutting off of the family. And this happens to be the version of it that we see in English folklore. And of course, there's I don't know if I want to say it's more gruesome. It's equally gruesome. It has its own local inflection for sure. But it's also interesting that that she's associated with fairies is completely not that completely falls in line, because again, we're talking about a liminal figure. If this hag serves an initiatory purpose, if she's moving you from one stage to the other, if it's between life and death, in some fashion, then she is a liminal figure. She is a figure on the boundaries, the way that the fairies are. So it absolutely makes sense that she's a fairy. But it's, she mentions here, she talks about them as being part of the Banshee, and says gifts of civilization supposedly came from the underworld, the entrance to which is often a hillside cave. I'm also reminded of the Morrigan's Cave, Owen, which is in Ireland, out near Rathcrohan. And that was also a cave, which, by the way, it's called Owen actually means Cave of the Cats. Okay, so the idea was, and there was the story of Cuchulainn and a couple of other heroes who were, there was a trickster, like a court jester there, who who invited them to a party, but none of them really wanted to go. So he actually himself wasn't there, but left them. It was a banquet, and like the best choice of meat was to like the best of the three of you, the bravest hero, or and so of course there were three heroes who were arguing over who actually was entitled to that, which was his intention. He was trying to start trouble, and Queen Maeve decides that they need to go out to Owen, and of course out of the cave comes these two. When we say cats, we don't mean like little kitty cats. We mean like big scary black panthers. I think that's what they were. In any case, they were big cats. And, they had to, two of the men ran away, and I think Cuchulainn was the one who stayed and dispatched them. So he was then considered to be, the bravest of them. That's how it was determined. I'm glossing over that myth quite a bit, but that's interesting that you have cats coming out of a cave that's considered to be a hellmouth, and that Black Anise herself is associated with cats. So you wonder if there's, in somehow that kind of connection has gotten mixed up somewhere. Now, Anise, she says, referred to as being derived from Anu, but as Leicester was settled by Anglo-Saxons as well as by Danes, equating her with a Celtic goddess may not be true. It says it also could have been derived from aniseed, which was used on the dead cat in that mock ritual. Aniseed was believed to avert the evil eye, and on one hand it's used to protect the magician from evil spirits, while on the other is used to call forth friendly ones. It's conceivable just that the aniseed was used to drive away the witch of the cave. Cats, of course, were often thought to be transformed witch out on the prowl. In oaks, there's much folklore and legend connected with them. So there's this idea that, you have this idea of the cat as a shape-shifting animal, and also as an animal connected with the underworld in some fashion, which may also be why she's there. Okay, so what else did I want to talk about here? Let's see. I've pulled up a number of sources, as I always do, and some of them are just very repetitive, so I don't really want to focus on that. But I do want to look at a little bit of her association. So we've talked about it. Okay, we've talked about devouring and about cannibalism and the comparison to the Lamia. The attribute of blue skin, as I mentioned, that could have to do with the fact that the coldness of the underworld, that one turns blue when they're cold, because there's no blood circulation. But it may also refer to, as we remember, goddesses like Kali, and all the associated Mahavidyas and Matrikas, many of them. The ones who are, as I think Kinsley put it, are the closest to liberation. So Kali, Tara, the ones that are actually, as opposed to ones, say for example, the Mahavidya Kamala, who is very close to, who's like a tantric Lakshmi, and it does not have that blue skin. You see Matangi with the green skin, and you see these, they represent these forces that threaten civilization. Matangi has to do with pollution, and these other goddesses like Tara, they do have to do with liberation, but they are connected with the cremation grounds, and they are also Tara in particular, and I'm talking the Hindu Tara, not the Buddhist one, is very much connected with sensuality, having sex, drinking wine, but, very traditionally what we think of as tantric, having tantric associations. So these are all aspects of the feminine that would be threatening, and they're always represented by figures with blue skin. Now you have like in Hinduism, you have others, like you have Krishna represented with blue skin, you have Vishnu, and even Shiva. They're all represented at different times with blue skin. So the blue skin actually represents a kind of holiness. Okay, the deep blue skin is a representation of holiness. So that gives us the sense that Black Anise may actually be a representation of older goddesses. If it seems far-fetched to think of something like Kali, do remember, too, that the Morrigan has been associated with Kali, and that there is at least some evidence to suggest that there may be a linguistic connection there between the two. Now, I don't think there's any historical evidence, that, say, Kali worship was brought to, anywhere in Ireland or England or anything like that. I don't think I'm suggesting that. But nonetheless, there has been suggested that there is a link. And I've had people dispute me on that as well and say that isn't true. And I say, yes, it is. I went back to the podcast I did on the Kali, I think it was. That one, I talk about that. But that came from a source, very, very, very credible academic source. I have a colleague who had dug up where he had found it. I'm not going to remember right now where he had found it, but I said to him, what was the source for that? And he gave it to me. So, and again, nobody's suggesting that Kali worship happened in Ireland or in England, but nonetheless, there's a curious way in which what we think of as Indo-European, how there seems to be some similarities between some names and certain deities in certain places. Okay. So the blue skin there, we see that as being associated with the more terrifying goddesses, certainly, and of the underworld. So I think we've talked about that. Let's see, I want to talk about cannibalism. I want to talk about the whole dead cat thing, and the idea of the cat being killed. It's like, the witch no longer has sway. The witch is killed, and if the aniseed is actually, even if it's named after her, that it might be a herb being used to repel her in some way. So in the way that, and I guess that you might see the association with Breege there, because on Breege's feast day at the beginning of February, which is really the beginning of spring for the Celts, they carry the Breegeog, which again, there's this representation of, kicking winter out and bringing prosperity in. Baba Yaga too. We talk about, Joanna and I talk about that in the Baba Yaga podcast. The way the traditions were, where she grew up in Poland, about getting rid of the winter and bringing in the spring, and the different rituals associated with that. So we definitely see a winter association. We see a coldness, the underworld, and also that devouring element, the idea of the divine mother that creates but also devours. And why devouring, you might say? Why not some other kind of death? Well, at least one reason that you can think of is that devouring has to do with the way in which one's individuality is taken away. So you think of yourself as a person. You have an identity. You are you. You are unique. Okay? When you're a baby, you're undifferentiated. You're a part of your mother. You're born. And then when you're born, there's a certain period of time at which psychologically, this is part of object relations theory, that you don't necessarily know that you're a separate being. But the first time a baby can recognize its reflection in a mirror, thus is the beginning of a separate identity. So the baby grows up, has a separate identity, and then suddenly what happens is, and then you become a teenager, and then of course when you're a teenager, mom and dad get away from me, everybody leave me alone, I'm me, I don't need to be associated with you. So there's a gradual move away from the collective, from the family to the individual. At least that's what tends to happen in the West. And it's, and we tend to view that as the maturation process, as the process of growing up. So, we have a horror of any kind of a system in which, one is still dependent on the family in adulthood. I mean, there may be a certain reason. I mean, sometimes people have certain disabilities or issues or things where they need to be. But the idea is that you are supposed to grow up to be independent. This is why the hero mythology is so prevalent. The hero who lives this pastoral existence as a child, but now reaches the crisis and now has to go out and go on their own underworld journey and go on their own thing, okay? We're very big on that in Western culture. Capitalism is very much built on the idea of I'm a rugged individual and I can do it my way and pull myself up on my bootstraps, and that's not entirely true, but nonetheless, that's certainly the aspiration or the goal of, or the, that's touted as the, I'm not finding the right word here, but that's considered to be the ideal, I suppose. Okay, that's what we're striving for. That's what we want to facilitate. And so, therefore, sometimes we totally forget about the collective. I mean, it's not that one shouldn't become an individual, but we tend to forget about the value of the collective. And, hey, this isn't all just about me. I have to think about the people around me and how what I do affects them as well. So there's this idea of the collective as being part of the feminine. And in our culture especially, we really kind of shy away from the collective. Socialism is a fine kind of collectivism. We don't do things that way. So there's the extra horror of the dark feminine, of the devouring dark feminine, because devouring means you've been devoured, like you are now subsumed again into the earth. You are part of the collective again that you came out of, and you are not an individual anymore. You're gone. So that loss of individuality there is just as terrifying for us as the other. You're you're subsumed back into that. Now, in the Eastern religion, that's kind of where you want to go. I mean, you want to be liberated from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, and become part of the Paramatman, become part of that collective soul in which you don't have an identity anymore, but you don't need one, because having an identity also brings suffering. So that I think, not to digress too far onto that point, but you have the idea there. So this is very interesting. If you happen to have any stories, if you happen to have taken the Leicester ghost tour, and you know of stories of people who have seen Black Anise either at Leicester Castle or at the Church of St. Mary de Castro, or anywhere around that Dane Hills area, please do write and let me know. Email me at Chthonia@chthonia.net, or if you're on YouTube, just go ahead and post it to the comments. Or you can post to me on Twitter, Facebook, wherever. I'm always happy to hear those kinds of stories, because I'm always interested in that, like what, when people see that, because I'm not somebody, I mean, yeah, sometimes people see things and it's not anything real, or it's just imagination, but there's also cases where that is definitely not the case. And we all know, one of the things we can all identify with is we don't like people telling us that we're delusional and that our experiences aren't real, or that they're dismissed. If you've gone through something, or especially something that may be traumatic to you, and people go, oh, no, you didn't, you just, haha, you just deceived yourself. You understand why people will double down on, like, no, it happened. And like I said, maybe there's cases where it didn't, and then there's other cases where you have to say, hey, you know what? You weren't there and you didn't have the experience. Jung would say the fact that you had the experience, whatever its objective reality is or not, your experience is a reality. So I'm always interested in that. Okay, now I feel like I'm going on too long, so I'm going to stop here. I thank you again for listening. Please visit Chthonia.net for all of my work. If you want to support my work, please visit patreon.com/Chthonia. I'll be very happy to have you as a supporter. And I want to very, very much thank those who are already supporting me and have been, through the last couple of years while I've been trying to build up this podcast and all the other work that I'm doing. And if you want to visit me on social media, I am Chthonia Podcast. 2 words on Facebook, 1 word on Twitter and Instagram, and just Chthonia on YouTube. That's it for me this time. See you next time.